Hello everyone, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum here in Morristown, Tennessee, and we'd like to welcome you all to today's video. But first, if you ever grew up watching the Looney Tunes show when you were a kid, then surely you remember the character of Sylvester J. Pussycat, more commonly referred to simply as Sylvester. Well, he is often known as the inveterate foe of Tweety Bird and Speedy Gonzales, as well as for his wacky and often unsuccessful attempts to catch and consume his prey. He's also known for his iconic phrase of Summer Succotash, which of course I do a horrible impression of. But interestingly enough, that phrase of his is going to be the topic for today's video. Succotash is a Native American dish originally believed to have been created in what is now known as New England. It is comprised of the three sisters, being corn, beans, and squash, but some historical recipes do attest to the fact that oftentimes meat could and would be added to the dish as an additional source of protein. But succotash sure is a funny sounding word. Where in the world do we get it from? Well, quite frankly, like with many things, there's a couple of different accounts as to how the dish actually got its name, but it is believed to have been derived from the old Narragansett word, Succotash, which means broken corn kernels. Regardless of whether or not that's true, why don't we dive into a little bit of the history behind how succotash came to be. Now, as one could easily imagine, the history of succotash is a long and varied one. This is a history not just of food and survival, but also of horticulture. Now, we have to understand that despite the fact that many people view the Native American diet similar to how they view the Viking diet or the typical frontiersman's diet, with great big old deer or hogs roasting on a spit in the fireplace, that's not necessarily true. In fact, one of the main foods of that day was stew. Stew was easy, it was quick, it was something that you could just go ahead, snatch up, throw whatever in that you had available, whether it was seasonal, salted, smoked, you name it. As long as it could go into the pot and turn out fairly tasty and get you through the next day, that's what you were going for. People didn't really have time to roast a whole bunch of meat, and quite frankly, I think it helps to stretch your meat a little bit further, which you'll want to do, especially in today's economy. But regardless of that, this is controversial because there is the iconic image of the Native American stalking in the woodlands with his bow and arrow in hand, ready to take down any prey that comes his way. But that's not entirely the case, as you could imagine. The majority of the Native American diet, especially in the woodlands, was comprised of whatever they could harvest from their gardens or whatever wild edible plants were available seasonally. But regardless, hunting and fishing was necessary. It was crucial, don't get me wrong, because it provided an additional source of protein. Now, we see that in many cases, this dish of succotash, being comprised of vegetables solely, was eaten on a frequent basis, and there was a time where, as today it's served as a side dish, it in many cases was the main or only course to be served at dinner that night. But regardless of that, it was also the dish that literally built empires, if you will. For example, probably one of the best examples of this that I have seen is Cahokia, where of course there's been a lot of work and research done, and also we see a beautiful collection of what mounds were made. Interestingly enough, those mounds were being built off of succotash. Now, there is a problem with that because these very big Mississippian mound building cultures, they had a hierarchy similar to royalty and nobility back in Europe, wherein the Native Americans were eating only vegetables, only whatever they could forage or harvest, whereas the meat would have been reserved for the upper class. This does pose a problem, and as anyone can tell you who has half a brain about them, that solely surviving on vegetables or solely surviving on meat, either one's going to lead to a bad time. You have to diversify, you have to have a balance in your diet, because either one can lead to certain particular health issues, which of course they unfortunately didn't know about at the time, because Dr. Oz, or Shaman Oz, as we could call him, was not around at the time. But, however, I will say that although these mounds were being built primarily on succotash, there were some mounds that were built with better food. Now, we do have to step back a little bit because we see that in the Paleolithic era, the big game hunters that we view them to be were not really big game hunters at all. And don't get me wrong, they killed their share of mammoths and what have you, but that takes a lot of work. Everything at that time took a lot of work, even to the time period that we focus on primarily. It takes a lot of work to have anything. Food, clothing, shelter, you name it. You kill an animal, guess what? You've got to process it. And you've got to process everything. If you harvest something, it still has to be processed. If you forage something, it still has to be processed. And you also have to figure out ways to preserve it without refrigeration or freezers for future use. I can attest to the adversity, if you will, that comes with trying to be self-sufficient, because it does take a lot of work. However, I've got it better because if I go out and kill a deer, then guess what? I can butcher it, and before I even have to worry about processing it, I can put it in a couple of plastic Ziploc bags, zip it up, put it in the freezer, and keep it until I'm ready to work on it. But these people didn't have that luxury back then, so they had to go for what was quick and easy. And succotash was one of those main dishes. Now, interestingly enough, though, succotash, as we know it today, with being comprised of the three sisters, was not entirely just corn, beans, and squash. Now, as we mentioned, there could be meat put into it, but before that, we have to look at the fact that from the Archaic to the Woodland period, there were rudimentary horticultural changes being made, and even so, they were mainly growing things like lamb's quarters, sunflowers, and squash. It wasn't until about 900 to 1000 AD that corn as we know it spread from Mexico, and then in 1300 AD, beans were going to follow shortly after. And as you can imagine, they were readily snatched up by an ever-growing, ever-hungry populace. And this is when we finally see the three sisters being grown as we know them today and being implemented into the dish of succotash. But it does make me wonder from time to time, because there are claims that certain Europeans were not available or not around to have tasted something similar to succotash, whether in the southeast or the north. Now, don't get me wrong, all these ingredients were very important, but they grew better in the southeast, but they were still just as important up in the north. And there is a claim going about that the first time Europeans in the north, or just in America as a whole, ever tasted succotash was in the 1600s. I find this claim a little doubtful for the fact of the matter that surely the Spanish conquistadors would have actually tasted a dish similar to succotash at the very least, which would have been comprised of those ingredients before then in the and possibly even before then in the 1400s. But unfortunately we'll never know. However, the best recorded evidence that I've been able to find as to where succotash was being shared with the Native Americans to the European settlers, it comes to us from 1643 in a book that Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, wrote about the Native American languages of New England. And in this, he mentions succotash by name and actually describes a type of corn dish which the Native Americans called nosomp, but the European settlers just simply shortened it to somp. And it was corn that was boiled and beaten. It could be served hot or cold with milk or butter. And he says, now you got to remember, at the beginning of the video, we talked about Succotash. Well, that's the Narragansett word. There was another word. He doesn't specify which tribe it's from, but he says that this particular dish was typically known as Mashultakash, which the Native American, or the Europeans, excuse me, ended up calling succotash. So where are we left at? Well, we're basically being left at. We've got a little bit more insight than what we did before, but we still don't have a definitive answer. And that's the way it is when studying history with a lot of things, folks. But when it comes to history, this does raise an interesting point, and that is, if the European settlers by the 1600s were on record as eating succotash, what recipe were they following? Was there any recipe? Better yet, what was the original recipe? Well, it didn't have 7 herbs and spices, I can tell you that. But the simple fact of the matter is that there is no set recipe. Not only because no one wrote anything down, but because this is something that a lot of historians tend to leave out when they are doing a presentation, portraying a character, you name it. This is the one thing that they leave out in their portrayal, and that is variety. Variety of people making and consuming the dish, the variety of taste, whether you like it sweeter, more savory, and of course, variety of available seasonal ingredients. So, it all boils down to variety. And if you want to taste some of that variety, then you can try this recipe here for Summer Succotash, in which you'll need 4 ounces of diced hog jowls or regular bacon. I went with bacon. Just seems to provide a better flavor, for my personal taste. You'll also need 2 to 3 quarts of water, 8 to 10 ears of corn, 1.5 cups of beans, either lima or kidney. Both of those hold up pretty well. Then you'll also need some salt, black pepper, and butter. So to start off, you're going to start by browning your bacon, then add it to about 2 to 3 quarts of water and bring to a boil. Next, trim the corn off of each ear so that you come up with about 4 cups of kernels. Be careful not to cut too closely to the kernels, as they will give a very bitter, unpleasant taste to the dish. Now, just as a word of advice, if you don't want to do the whole thing of cutting the kernels off the ears of corn, you can easily go the canned corn, canned beans route. It's easy. Very, very easy. And no, I won't judge you if you use canned goods. But afterwards, you're going to, once your water has come to a low boil, you're going to need to add your corn cobs and your beans and boil them for about 20 minutes. Now, here's where there's a difference between your canned and your dried beans. If you use dried beans, you'll need to soak them overnight and then drain off the water before you add them to the pot. But if you've got canned beans, then if you want to, you can drain them and rinse them off, but they're already pre-cooked, so it's going to take a lot less time for preparation overall. But regardless, again, I'm not going to judge. Afterwards, after about 20 minutes, then you're going to remove the corn cobs from your dish and then add in the kernels and season with some salt and black pepper, of course, to your taste. Then bring to a boil for 15 minutes. After that's elapsed, make sure your beans are good and soft. The bacon, if you brown it up to where it's just below the point of being crispy, it should hold up pretty good. There's still going to be a lot of flavor in your succotash. And then afterwards, you can top it off with a little butter. I typically, in a pot, I put about 2 tablespoons. That seems to be plenty fine right there. And then afterwards, you need to go ahead, put it into a bowl, serve it up. And as an added bonus, I will tell you to make your best recipe for cornbread, because with this recipe for Summer Succotash, then you are going to want that cornbread to soak up the juices and eat it afterwards. This dish in particular is a favorite of mine and my wife's. I make it on a regular basis because it's quick, it's easy, it's cheap, which is great for today's economy. And trust me, it's quite good. I genuinely think you'll like it. So hopefully you'll be encouraged to go and try this recipe, which will be listed in the description attached to the video. However, if you do try it, feel free to let me know as to whether or not you like it. But aside from all that, if you do like what we do here at the Crockett Tavern Museum, then please feel free to like, share, and subscribe, as well as click the bell icon so you'll never miss an upload. But folks, that concludes today's video, and I've already taken enough time out of your day, so I'm going to go ahead and make myself scarce. Until next week, this is Isaac White from the Crockett Tavern Museum, signing off for now, saying goodbye and God bless.